The earth trembled under the hooves of a million horses, a deep, endless vibration that seemed to come not only from the ground but from history itself, as if the world already knew what was coming and could not stop it. From the vast, wind-scoured grasslands of Central Asia rose a force unlike anything civilization had ever faced: the Mongols. They did not arrive like traditional armies, slow and ceremonial, weighed down by supply lines and pride. They came like a living storm, fast, silent, and merciless, moving with the precision of nature itself. To call them merely warriors would be a mistake. They were an idea in motion, a system of conquest perfected through discipline, intelligence, and ruthless efficiency. Each rider was trained from childhood to live in the saddle, to fire arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed, to survive with almost nothing, and to obey without hesitation. Cities that resisted them were not simply defeated. They were erased, wiped from maps, turned into warnings carved into ash and bone. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries, fortified by towering walls and proud traditions, collapsed in a matter of weeks, their rulers shocked not just by defeat, but by the speed at which it arrived. To the Mongols, walls were invitations, not obstacles, and numbers were meaningless when faced with tactics built on deception, mobility, and psychological terror. They feigned retreats to lure armies into traps, struck supply lines instead of armies, and spread fear ahead of them like a weapon, ensuring that many cities surrendered before a single arrow was fired. Empires tried to stop them. The Khwarezmian Empire, confident in its wealth and fortresses; the Jin dynasty, trusting in its massive population and long borders; the Abbasid Caliphate, believing its spiritual authority and ancient capital would protect it. But one by one, they fell, stunned by an enemy that refused to fight by the rules they understood. Baghdad burned, its libraries and palaces reduced to ruins, sending a message that no center of power was untouchable. To those who watched from afar, it seemed as if destiny itself rode with the Mongols, as if the world had entered an age where resistance was pointless and survival depended only on submission. Stories spread faster than the armies themselves. Stories of entire populations slaughtered, of rivers running red, of skulls stacked into towers as monuments to defiance. Fear became their shadow, stretching far beyond the reach of their arrows, paralyzing kings before the battle even began. Yet as their banners pushed farther west, as their scouts rode into unfamiliar lands and their maps filled with forests instead of plains, something began to change. The air grew colder, the terrain harsher, the world less willing to bend. Among merchants, refugees, and travelers fleeing ahead of the Mongol advance, whispers began to circulate, quiet at first, then persistent, of distant northern lands where conquest was not so simple. Beyond the great forests, beyond frozen rivers and storm-lashed seas, lived warriors shaped not by empire, but by survival. Men who did not measure life in years, but in deeds, who did not fear death because they believed death in battle was a reward, not an end. These were not kings ruling over vast populations, nor cities glittering with wealth. They were fighters born into cold, raised in hardship, hardened by nature itself. Unlike the empires of the South and East, they did not rely on walls to protect them, because their world offered no such comfort. They relied on shields, on brotherhood, and on a belief system that taught them to face death with open eyes. To them, terror was not a weapon, it was an illusion. As the Mongol horizon darkened with dust and banners, these whispers grew into a name spoken with equal parts curiosity and unease. The Mongols, who had shattered empires and humbled kings, were moving toward a world that did not fear storms because it had been forged by them. And in that cold, distant north, where iron met ice and courage was measured in scars, The warriors who waited were known by a name that carried its own legend, its own history of blood and defiance. They called them Vikings. The North was a different world, one that did not welcome invaders with open plains or fertile cities, but tested every step with cold, darkness, and unforgiving terrain. And it was here that the Mongols' advance began to feel unfamiliar, even hostile. The land narrowed, forests thickened, and the open horizons that had once allowed their cavalry to dominate now closed in like a trap, replacing speed with uncertainty and freedom with constraint. In these lands, the wind cut like a blade, and the sea roared with a voice as violent as any battlefield, shaping a people who did not expect mercy from nature and therefore did not ask it from their enemies. The Vikings were not waiting behind walls or in golden capitals. They were scattered among coasts, fjords, and rugged settlements, bound together not by empire, but by reputation, oath, and the promise of honor. From childhood, they were taught that a man's worth was measured not by how long he lived, but by how he faced danger, and death in battle was not feared, because it opened the gates to Valhalla, where warriors feasted forever beneath the gaze of the gods. When Mongol scouts pushed into these regions, they expected what they had always found: panic, flight, and easy submission. But instead they encountered silence, watchful eyes, and warriors who did not break formation when arrows fell, who did not scatter when horses charged, and who did not beg when blood stained the snow. The first encounters were small, almost insignificant by the standards of empire, yet they carried a shock the Mongols had rarely felt. Their enemies did not run. Viking shield walls formed like living fortresses, overlapping iron and wood, absorbing arrows while axes and spears waited with patient violence. And when the distance closed, the battle turned into brutal, intimate chaos where speed mattered less than strength and resolve. The Mongols were masters of motion, striking from afar and vanishing before retaliation. But here the terrain stole that advantage, forcing them into close quarters where the rhythm of combat changed, and every strike carried the weight of survival. Horses struggled on rocky ground and slick snow. Formations fractured in narrow passes, and communication faltered in dense forests where horns and signals echoed unpredictably. For the first time, Mongol commanders faced fighters who did not react with fear to psychological warfare, who did not surrender at the sight of overwhelming force, and who seemed to draw strength from the very danger meant to break them. Viking warriors roared as they advanced, not as a tactic, but as an expression of belief, calling on gods of thunder and war, turning battle into ritual as much as conflict. Axes crashed against sabers, shields splintered under repeated blows, and the ground became a mix of mud, snow, and blood, while neither side could claim the swift, decisive victory the Mongols were used to. This was not the sweeping conquest of cities or the collapse of empires. It was resistance in its rawest form, fought village by village, skirmish by skirmish, where every step forward demanded a price. The Mongols adapted as they always had, adjusting tactics, probing for weaknesses, yet even their adaptability met limits in a land that refused to bend to mounted warfare, where the sea could isolate forces and winter itself became an enemy. The Vikings, for their part, did not seek conquest or glory beyond their shores. They fought to defend what they knew, and that focus gave them a resilience that could not be easily broken. Unlike imperial armies motivated by orders and fear of punishment, these warriors fought beside kin and brothers, with reputations and songs waiting to be written, and that made retreat a far more complex decision than survival alone. Every clash became a statement, not of who would rule, but of who would stand. And in that collision of worlds, the disciplined, calculated brutality of the Mongols against the ferocious, belief-driven defiance of the Vikings, the myth of Mongol invincibility began to crack. It was not shattered in a single battle or sealed by a famous defeat, but eroded through encounters that denied the Mongols what they relied on most: dominance without resistance. Here, in the cold north, conquest was no longer inevitable, and the Mongols learned that there existed warriors for whom fear was useless, whose world had already taught them that survival was earned through struggle, not surrender. In the aftermath of countless skirmishes, battles fought in the forests, fjords, and icy shores of the north, a realization began to settle over the Mongols like a cold wine through the mountains. The world was no longer theirs to simply take by force, and for the first time, they confronted the limits of their terrifying reach. History remembers them as destroyers of empires, the conquerors who razed cities, who crushed armies with a combination of speed, precision, and fear. Yet in these distant lands, the rules were different, and the legends of northern warriors prove that even the most formidable power could meet resistance that would not bend. The Vikings were not bound by territory or ambitions of empire. They did not accumulate wealth or slaves as measures of success, and they fought not for domination, but for honor, kin, and a way of life that demanded courage above all else. In these clashes, the Mongols discovered that their usual instruments of victory, terror, overwhelming numbers, and unparalleled mobility, were often ineffective when faced with people who did not fear them, who welcomed death in battle as a noble end rather than a punishment, and whose environment itself was a weapon. Narrow passes turned cavalry charges into chaos. Frozen rivers became obstacles to coordination, and forests provided cover where Mongol arrows could not strike with the same devastating effect. Each encounter, whether a small skirmish or a larger confrontation, chipped away at the assumption that the Mongols could bend the world to their will, teaching a lesson that would echo in the stories of warriors and chroniclers alike: that conquest is never absolute, and that the greatest power can be resisted by courage, unity, and unyielding spirit. The Vikings, in contrast to the empires the Mongols had destroyed, fought with an intimacy and intensity that transformed every battle into a test of endurance and heart, turning the clash of steel into a ritual of survival where every victory, no matter how small, was a declaration of defiance. Even as the Mongols regrouped and adapted, they faced a truth they could not easily overcome. Here were people who could not be intimidated, who understood the terrain better than any invader, and whose values placed courage above life itself, making fear the weapon that had felled kings and armies powerless. Legends of these encounters, whether fully documented or passed down through oral tales, emphasize the paradox of history. The same force that could destroy vast civilizations met opposition in the north that was neither organized in the traditional sense nor motivated by conquest, yet its effectiveness rivaled, and in some way surpassed, the might of empires. The Mongols had mastered war as the art of domination, but the Vikings embodied war as a philosophy of survival, teaching that skill and strategy are only one part of the equation, and that the spirit of a people can equal or exceed even the deadliest army when guided by conviction and courage. Over time, the world remembered the Mongols as the conquerors of empires, but among northern songs, sagas, and oral histories, there endured a subtle, powerful truth. There were warriors who could face the storm and not flinch, who could meet the horde and refuse to yield, and whose legacy was not built on the land they took, but on the lives they preserved and the honor they defended. This realization, though perhaps not recorded in the annals of southern kingdoms, became a defining moment in the mythology of both peoples, a story told not in victories or defeats alone, but in the recognition of strength beyond force, resilience beyond fear, and the enduring human capacity to resist domination when values, courage, and skill converge. And so, the legend remains. The Mongols could destroy the world's empires with speed, cunning, and terror. Yet in the north, they met men who had been forged by hardship, bound by kinship, and guided by code that valued honor and fearlessness above all else. These encounters did not produce a single decisive conquest or a famous treaty. Instead, they left a legacy of possibility, the idea that even the most unstoppable force can be met with resistance that is both unyielding and inspiring. The Vikings did not defeat the Mongols with armies of thousands or walls of stone. They did so with the courage of people who could not be intimidated, with the tenacity of those who thrived in hardship, and with the unbreakable spirit of a culture that refused to surrender to fear, proving that power alone is never enough to conquer every heart, and that some legends endure precisely because they are never fully tamed. It was a lesson that resonated beyond the battlefield, reminding all who would come after that true strength lies not in terror or domination, but in the courage to stand, the wisdom to endure, and the unshakable will to preserve what one holds sacred, even in the face of what the world believes to be inevitable. And in that cold, wind-swept north, among the forests, fjords, and icy shores, the myth of the Mongol invincibility met its first true challenge. Not in armies that could rival them in size or firepower, but in human hearts that refused to yield. And it is there, in that crucible of resistance, that the story of the Mongols and the Vikings is forever etched into the annals of history, as a testament to the enduring power of courage over fear and spirit over steel.